Welcome, brothers and sisters, seekers and thinkers, listeners from near and far. This is the first of what we are calling the Temple Lectures with myself, Joseph Anthony, broadcast here on Rock of Truth Radio, the teaching and outreach arm of Rock of Truth Church. Today begins Temple Lecture 1, How Humanity Learned to See, Why Nature Was Your First Bible and Scripture. And we are starting at the beginning, not because we don't have answers, but because we want to ask better questions. Not because we want to go backward, but because we want to go deeper. Not because we want to argue with the world, but because we want to understand it. These temple lectures are not debates. They are not fear-based sermons. They're not here to tell you what to think. They are here to help you see. We are doing these lectures because too many people today feel disconnected from life, from meaning, from God, and from themselves. They feel anxious. They feel rushed. They feel overwhelmed. They feel like they are always reacting, never resting. And this is not how the human mind was designed to live. So we are returning to the foundations, not of religion, but of understanding, before doctrines, before denominations, and before institutions. We are asking, how did human beings first make sense of the world? How did meaning begin? How did wisdom form? How did people learn to live without panic? Because if we can remember how we learned, we can remember how to live. These temple lectures are about restoring spiritual literacy, symbolic literacy, pattern literacy, nature literacy. They are about remembering how to see again, not just with your eyes, but with your awareness. We are starting from the beginning because when you understand the beginning, everything else becomes clearer. Fear becomes quieter. Confusion becomes curiosity. Faith becomes grounded. If you are tired of shallow answers, if you're tired of being told what to think, if you're tired of spirituality that feels disconnected from your life, then you're in the right place. Rock of Truth Church exists to teach, not to threaten, to awaken, not to shame, to build, not to break. And you can find us at rockoftruthchurch.org. We gather here on Rock of Truth Radio for temple lectures on Sundays and Thursdays, not to escape the world, but to understand it, not to inherit beliefs, but to grow wisdom. So settle in, breathe, listen, because today we begin again. Before there were books, there was the world. Before there were scriptures, there was the sky. Before there were sermons, there were seasons. Human beings did not begin by reading, they began by watching. They watched the sun rise and set. They watched the moon grow full and then disappear. They watched animals migrate across the land. They watched seeds fall into the ground, disappear, and then rise again. They watched storms gather, lightning split the sky, rivers overflow, and fire change everything it touched. This is how meaning was first learned, not through words, not through pages, not through theology, but through experience. Early humans did not sit around asking, what does God want? They asked, why does this happen? Why does the light always return after darkness? Why does life die and come back? Why does the world move in rhythms instead of chaos? Why does everything seem to repeat? These questions did not come from books, they came from attention. And attention is the beginning of wisdom. Nature was the first teacher. The world was the first classroom, and the sky was the first scripture. Long before anyone wrote down a verse, the universe was already speaking. Long before there was theology, there was testimony. Long before there was doctrines, there were patterns. And those patterns taught the human mind how to think. This matters because we've been taught to believe the opposite, that meaning starts in the books, that truth starts in institutions, that wisdom starts when someone tells you what to believe. But that is not how the human story began. Religion did not create meaning, meaning created religion. Stories did not come first, experience did. Symbols did not come first, observation did. When you understand this, something shifts. You stop reading ancient texts as rule books. You stop seeing them as control systems. you start recognizing them as memory systems. They were never meant to replace the world. They were meant to help us remember it. And when you realize that, you begin to see something profound. God was not first written on paper. God was first written in the sky. God was first written in cycles. God was first written in light and darkness, seed and soil, breath and body. The universe was humanity's first holy book, and we have forgotten how to read it. That forgetting is not harmless. It changes how we see everything. It makes us afraid. It makes us dependent. It makes us feel lost. But this series is not about remembering, not believing more, not fearing more, not obeying more, but seeing again. And that begins where it always did, with the world. Religion did not come first, experience did. Before people built temples, they lived inside the world. Before they created rituals, they faced reality. Before they named gods, they met forces. They felt the heat of the sun on their skin. They felt the fear of storms shaking the ground. They felt hunger, birth, love, loss, pain, and death. They watched life grow, decay, and return. This is how meaning begins, not with belief, but with awareness. Early humans did not have theology. They had weather. They did not have doctrine. They had daylight and darkness. They did not have scriptures. They had seasons. And those seasons were not just changes in temperature, they were lessons. They taught that nothing stays the same. They taught that the endings are not final. They taught that life moves in rhythms, not straight lines. They taught that what disappears often returns. Religion did not appear to invent meaning, it appeared to preserve meaning. It was a memory system, a way of passing wisdom from parent to child, from elder to youth, from generation to generation. Religion began as remembrance, but somewhere along the way, we reversed the order. We started believing that religion created truth instead of realizing that truth created religion. We began thinking ancient people were less intelligent because they didn't have books, but they were not less intelligent. They were more attentive. They had to be. Their survival depended on watching carefully, on remembering what happened, on noticing patterns, on recognizing signs. If they missed the signs, they didn't just lose comfort, they lost their lives. So they learned the world's first and not theories about it. And from that learning, stories were born. From stories, symbols were formed. From symbols, religion emerged. Religion was not the beginning of wisdom, it was the container of wisdom. And when you understand that, you stop seeing ancient religion as superstition. You stop dismissing it as primitive. You start recognizing it as memory, memory of how the world works, memory of how life moves, memory of what can be trusted. This is why so many ancient traditions say, look, watch, and pay attention. Because attention is not just focus, attention is reverence. To observe something deeply is to honor it. And when people lose the ability to observe, they start demanding answers instead of discovering them. They start clinging instead of learning. They start fearing instead of understanding. But wisdom has always worked the same way. First comes seeing, then comes meaning, then comes the story, then comes symbol, then comes religion. Never the other way around. And when you restore that order, you don't lose faith, you deepen it. The first humans did not ask, who is God? They asked, why does this happen? Why does the sun disappear and then return? Why does the moon change its shape? Why do storms come and go? Why does fire destroy and also warm? Why does water give life and sometimes take it away? Why does every living thing grow, age, die, and somehow return again? These were the first mysteries, not philosophical, not theological, not abstract, physical, emotional, and real. Ancient people were not living inside of ideas, they were living inside of events. They did not separate the natural from the sacred the way we do. To them, what happened was what mattered. If something had power, it was meaningful. If something changed life, it was sacred. If something returned again and again, it was worth remembering. They did not need a book to feel awe. They did not need doctrine to feel wonder. They did not need a sermon to feel mystery. They lived inside mystery every day. Imagine standing under a sky you do not control. Imagine depending on rain you cannot command. Imagine knowing that winter is coming and you cannot stop it. Imagine seeing death constantly and yet also seeing life always return. This is the environment that shaped the human mind. Meaning was not invented, it was discovered. When something happened once, it was an event. When it happened again, it became a pattern. When it keeps happening, it becomes a message. And that message was simple. The world is not random. The world has rhythm, and the world has memory. This is where all ancient wisdom begins, not in belief, but in noticing, not in doctrine, but in discernment, not in command, but in curiosity. They did not ask, what should I believe? They asked, what is happening? At that question is far more powerful than we realize because belief can be inherited, but understanding must be earned. This is why ancient knowledge was not fragile, it was grounded. It came from watching birth, watching death, watching the sun, watching the moon, watching the seeds fall and rise again. And when people saw these things repeating, they knew they were important, not because someone told them so, but because life itself said so. And this is what we have forgotten. We've been trained to start with answers. They started with questions. We've been trained to start with beliefs. They started with observation. We've been trained to start with words. They started with just the world. And when you reverse that order, you don't lose spirituality, you rediscover it. Because mystery was never supposed to be hidden behind language, it was always meant to be visible. Early humans did not just see events, they noticed repetition. They saw the sun rise every morning. They saw it set every evening. They saw the moon grow full and then fade away. They saw the seasons change and then return. They saw life follow a rhythm, birth, growth, death, and renewal. And something powerful happened when they noticed this. They remembered. And the memory is not just storing information, memory is recognizing patterns. When something happens once, it's an event. Happens again, becomes a lesson. And when it keeps happening, there is meaning behind it. This is how the human mind awakened. It didn't do that through books, not through theories, not through explanations, through rhythm. Pattern taught them that world was not random, that it had order, that it had structure, that it had continuity. And where there is order, there's understanding. Where there's understanding, there's trust. Where there's trust, there's peace. This is why the sky became sacred. It never lied. It rose, it set, it returned again and again. Every sunrise was a promise. Every season was a reassurance, and every cycle was a lesson in patience. This is why ancient people were not obsessed with control. They were obsessed with timing. They didn't ask, how can I force life to obey me? They asked, how can I move with life? Pattern taught them that endings were not final, that darkness did not last forever, that loss was not the end of the story. Winter always gave way to spring, night always gave way to morning, seeds always rose again, and this shaped the human heart. It taught hope without denial. It taught patience without passivity, and it taught faith without fantasy. Not faith in ideas, but faith in rhythm. That is why ancient wisdom is calm, does not panic, it doesn't rush, it does not scream. It waits because it has seen this before. We, however, live in a world that has forgot pattern. We're taught to expect constant novelty, constant urgency, constant crisis. But the human soul was not designed for chaos. It was designed for rhythm. And when we lose rhythm, we lose meaning. We begin to think everything is random. We begin to think everything is fragile. We begin to think everything is about to fall apart. But ancient people did not live in fear because they recognized return. They trusted the cycle. This is why they planted. This is why they waited. And this is why they rested. Patterns created meaning, and meaning created stability. Not because life was easy, but because life was understandable. And when you understand the rhythm of life, you stop fighting it and you begin to live inside it. Once human beings began to recognize these patterns, something new happened. Now they began to tell stories, not for entertainment, not for fiction, not for fantasy, but once again, for memory. A story is not a lie. A story is a way of remembering what matters. When ancient people saw the sun disappear every night and return every morning, they didn't say that's just science. They said that is a journey. When they saw seasons die and reborn, they didn't say it was just the weather. They said that is resurrection. When they saw seeds fall into the ground and rise again, they didn't say that's biology. They said that is transformation. Stories were how humans made sense of repeating experiences. A story was a way to hold the meaning in the mind, a way to pass it from mouth to ear, from elder to child, from generation to generation. A story was not an escape from reality, it was a map of reality. This is where the word myth has been misunderstood. Today, when people hear myth, they think fake. Ancient people meant meaning. A myth was not a lie, it was a memory system. It was a way to encode truth into a form that could be remembered, repeated, and lived. They didn't write down facts, they wove them into stories. Why? Because facts can be forgotten, stories are remembered. A list of data disappears, a story stays alive. Stories have faces, stories have movement, stories have emotion, stories live inside us. That is why every culture on earth has stories, not because humans love fantasy, but because humans need meaning. Story is how pattern becomes personal. Story is how rhythm becomes relatable. Story is how cosmic movements become human lessons. When people forgot the patterns, they kept the stories. When they forgot the meanings, they kept the rituals. When they forgot the reasons, they kept the forms. And that is how mythology was born, not as deception, but as preservation. But when modern people look at ancient stories without understanding what they were preserving, they dismiss them. They say that's childish, that's primitive, that's superstition, that's pagan. But those stories are not childish. They're not, they are ancient memory. They are records of how the human mind learned to make sense of the world. They're how people learned patience, how they learned hope, how they learned that endings are not always endings. Stories taught people how to live inside uncertainty without despair. And that is not childish, that's wise. When you understand this, you stop mocking ancient stories and you start listening because they were never trying to entertain you, they were trying to teach you how to survive. Before there were schools, there was the sky. Before there were calendars, there were stars. And before there were clocks, there were shadows. The heavens were humanity's first classroom. Every morning the sun rose. Every evening it set. Every month the moon changed. Every year the stars shifted their places. And none of it was random. Ancient people learned by watching the sky. They did not need numbers to understand time. They understood rhythm. They knew when to plant. They knew when to harvest. They knew when animals would migrate. They knew when floods would come. They knew when winter was approaching. The sky taught survival, but it also taught meaning because anything that can be trusted becomes sacred. Anything that returns becomes holy. Anything that brings life becomes divine. The heavens did not speak in words, they spoke in motion, they spoke in light, they spoke in rhythm. This is why ancient people said the sky declares, not because they believed it had a voice, but because they were listening with their eyes. They learned patience from the stars, they learned timing from the moon, and they learned endurance from the seasons. The sky was not a decoration, it was their teacher, and it taught something profound. Life is not chaotic. It's ordered, not controlled, but ordered. There is a difference. Control is forced. Order is natural. Sky never rushed, never panicked, it never hurried, and yet it never failed. This taught the ancient people how to live. They did not rush life. They did not panic at endings. They did not demand immediate answers. They trusted return. This is why ancient spirituality is calm. It's not frantic. It's not hysterical. It's not obsessed with certainty. It's grounded because it was shaped by something that never lied. We, however, live inside buildings, under ceilings, under artificial lights. We have forgotten how to look up. We have forgotten how to watch. And when we forget how to watch, we lose patience. We lose timing. We lose trust. We start demanding immediate answers to questions that require seasons. We start forcing outcomes that require growth. We start panicking at darkness instead of trusting dawn. The sky never needed to explain itself. It simply kept returning, and that was enough. This is where the ancient people trusted, not a theory, not a doctrine, not a rule book, a rhythm. This is why they did not need constant reassurance. They had the stars, and the stars never broke their promises. Before humans had words, they had bodies. Before they had alphabets, they had movement. Before they had speech, they had gesture. The first language was not spoken, it was shown. People pointed, they mimicked, they acted things out. They used their hands, their posture, their faces, their movement. If someone wanted to warn others of danger, they didn't explain it. They became the danger. They crouched down, they froze, they fled. If someone wanted to show a bird, they didn't describe it. They flapped. They leapt in the air. They imitated it. This is how meaning was first shared, not through sound, but through sight, not through explanation, but through experience. The body became the first dictionary. Hands became the first sentences. Movement became the first grammar. This is why ancient cultures used dance, ritual, posture, and drama. They were not performing, they were teaching. They were not entertaining each other or performing superstitious rituals. They were remembering. They were preserving meaning in the only way that it existed through the living body. This is why early rituals were physical. People walked in circles. They raised their arms. They bowed. They fasted. They moved with the seasons, not because they were superstitious, but because they were symbolic. They were acting out what they understand about life. The body remembered before the mind had words. And this matters because it tells us something about who we are. We are not thinking beings who happen to have bodies. We are embodied beings who learn to think. Meaning entered the human mind through senses, through sight, sound, touch, and movement. This is why children understand before they can explain. This is why emotion often comes before logic. This is why music moves us without words. We were designed to understand through experience first, but modern culture reverses this. We teach children definitions before they discovery, rules before wonder, belief before understanding. And then we wonder why people feel disconnected from life. The ancient world knew something we have forgotten. Meaning must be lived before it can be spoken. That is why the body was the first scripture. It carried memory, it carried rhythm, and it carried a story. And when words finally came, they were not replacements for the body, they were attempts to describe what the body already knew. This is why spirituality is not just something you think, it is something you inhabit. It is something you move inside of. It's something you live. And when you forget that, faith becomes abstract, dry, and distant. But when you remember it, faith becomes embodied again, real, alive, grounded, not floating in theories, but walking on the earth. Long before people wrote sounds, they drew. They carved, they painted, they etched, they stacked stones, they marked walls. Why? Because pictures came before letters. Early humans did not think in paragraphs, they thought in images. A single picture could hold an entire story. A single symbol could carry generations of memory. A spiral could mean time. A circle could mean eternity. A bird could mean sky. A tree could mean life. Snake could mean renewal. This is how meaning was stored, not in sentences, but in symbols, not in explanations, but in signs. This is why the oldest human records are not books. They are cave paintings, carvings, totems, statues, glyphs. These were not decorations. They were not art projects. They were not superstition. These were once again memory devices, or how people stored wisdom before paper existed. They were how people taught before classrooms existed. They are how people remembered before libraries existed. A symbol could compress an entire story into a single image. This is something modern people often miss. We are trained to explain everything with words, but words came later. Images came first. And images do something words cannot. They speak instantly. They bypass argument. They bypass logic. They go straight to understanding. This is why a single picture can move you more than a paragraph. This is why a symbol can affect you even if you don't know why. Symbols speak the language of the subconscious. They are not designed to convince you. They are designed to awaken recognition. This is why symbols are so powerful. And this is also why they can be misused. If people do not know how to read symbols, they become controlled by them. They react without understanding. They fear without knowing why. They follow without clarity. Ancient people were not naive about symbols. They created them intentionally. They taught them carefully. They explained them with their communities. We have inherited the symbols, but lost the explanations. So now we argue over stories that were never meant to be literal. We fight over images that were meant to be instructional. We defend metaphors as if they were history. And this creates confusion. But when you understand that pictures came before letters, you stop trying to read ancient texts like modern textbooks. You start reading them like symbolic memory. You start asking, what is this trying to show me? Not what is this trying to prove? And that single shift changes everything because truth does not always arrive as a sentence. Sometimes it arrives as a picture. When you learn how to see again, you realize you have been surrounded by meaning this entire time. To ancient people, animals were not just animals, they were teachers. They were not worshiped as gods, they were observed as signs because animals did something humans could not yet explain. They lived in perfect relationship with their environment. They moved with instinct. They knew when to migrate, they knew when to rest, they knew when to hunt, and they knew when to hide. And ancient people watched them. Birds live in the sky, so birds became symbols of freedom, spirit, and higher vision. Serpents lived close to the ground, so serpents became symbols of earth, cycles, renewal, and transformation. Lions, they showed strength. Wolves, they showed loyalty. Bulls, they showed power. Fish, they showed abundance. These were not fantasies. They were observations. Ancient people studied how animals lived, how they survived, how they adapted, how they moved through the world, and they turned those traits into living lessons. Animals became memory keepers, not because they were magical, but because they were meaningful. When ancient people carved animals into stone, they were not decorating, they were teaching. When they painted animals on cave walls, they weren't entertaining, they were remembering. They were saying, look at this creature, notice what it does, learn from it. This is what symbolism is. Symbolism is not superstition, it is pattern recognition. It is the mind saying, this thing teaches me something about life. But modern people often misunderstand this. They think ancient people were worshiping animals. They weren't. They were reading them. They were learning from them. They were encoding knowledge in forms that could be remembered. A child can forget a lecture, but they will remember a story about a lion. A person can forget a rule, but they will remember a symbol. This is why animals became teachers. This is also why ancient stories are filled with animals, not because people were childish, but because they were wise. They understood that meaning must be embodied. It must be seen, must be felt, must be experienced, not just explained. But when modern people lose symbolic literacy, they close this entire language. They read ancient stories and they think they are silly. They see animals and myths and think it is a fantasy. What they are really seeing is a memory system they no longer understand. When you forget how to read symbols, you become literal. And when you become literal, you become rigid. You start arguing over stories instead of learning from them. But ancient stories were not written to be believed, they were written to be understood. And animals were among humanity's first teachers, not with words, but with life. The ancient people, sacred, did not mean mysterious. It did not mean magic. It did not mean untouchable. It meant meaningful. Something was sacred because it mattered. Something was holy because it sustained life. Something was divine because it could be trusted. Sun was sacred because it gave light. Water is sacred because it gives life. Fire is sacred because it transformed. And the earth was sacred because it fed. Nothing became holy by command. Nothing became sacred by decree. Sacredness was not assigned, it was recognized. When something could be relied on, it became sacred. When something returned again and again, it became holy. When something preserved life, it became divine. This is very different from how we think today. Today, we think something is sacred because someone tells us it is. Ancient people believed something was sacred because it proved it was. Every sunrise was a promise. Every season was a lesson. Every cycle was a reassurance. They did not separate the spiritual from the physical. They did not divide heaven from earth. They did not split meaning from matter. To them, the sacred was visible. It was in the sky. It was in the soil. It was in the river that flows. It was in the seed that sprouted out of the ground. They did not go looking for God in abstractions. They saw God in patterns. They saw God in return, in renewal, in endurance. This is why ancient spirituality was grounded. It was not floating in theories. It was not trapped in belief systems. It was lived. People prayed with their planting. They worshiped with their waiting, and they honored with their harvest. Sacredness was not something you thought about, it was something you participated in. But somewhere along the way, we lost this. We started thinking sacred meant separate, holy meant distance, and the divine meant unreachable. And when meaning becomes distance, people feel abandoned. They feel small, unworthy, afraid. But ancient people did not feel small in the presence of the sacred. They felt connected. They belonged to the world. They moved with it. They trusted it. This is why their spirituality did not make them anxious. It made them stable. They did not ask, is God near? They saw God rising every morning. They did not ask, does life care? They saw life return every spring. They did not ask, is there hope? They planted. And the planting is an act of faith. And when nature became sacred, life became meaningful. And when life is meaningful, fear loses its grip. This is what we are remembering, not a new belief, an old way of seeing. In the beginning, people did not have religion. They had meaning. They had memory. They had stories. They had rhythms, symbols. They passed what they learned from their parents to the child, to the elder, to the youth, and from one generation to the next. They taught by watching the sky, and they taught following the seasons. They taught observing animals. They taught by telling stories around fires. And this was definitely not religion. This was remembrance. But over time, something changed. The original experience began to fade. The people who had seen the first patterns passed away. The stories remained, but the reasons behind them slowly disappeared. And when people forget why they do something, they often keep doing it anyway. This is how religion was born, not as deception, not as control, not as superstition, but as preservation. Religion was an attempt to protect the meaning. It was an effort to hold on to wisdom. And when direct experience was no longer available, the stories were kept, the symbols were kept, the rituals were kept, but slowly the explanations got lost. And when explanations are lost, structures take their place. Rituals replace understanding. Form replaces meaning. Tradition replaces insight. It's not failure of ancient people. It is a natural human process. When memory fades, we build systems. When insight fades, we build institutions. When meanings fades, we build rules. Religion became a container, but a container is not the content. And this is where confusion enters. People began worshiping the container instead of what it was meant to carry. They began defending the story instead of understanding the pattern. They began arguing over symbols instead of learning from them. This is why religions often fight each other. They are guarding different containers that often once held similar, if not the same wisdom. And when people forget the original meaning, they start clinging to the form. And when people cling, they become afraid. But religion was never meant to make people afraid. It was meant to help them remember the cycles, rhythms, life returns, and that darkness is not final. Religion was the mat, not a cage. It was a reminder, not a prison. And when you understand this, you stop attacking religion and you stop worshiping it and you start using it as it was always meant to be used, as a memory of meaning. All this matters for one simple reason. When people forget how to read the world, they become afraid of it. When people lose the ability to see meaning, they start searching for control. When people stop recognizing patterns, they begin to believe everything is random, and randomness feels terrifying. Ancient people were not fearless because they were ignorant, they were calm because they were observant. They saw the order, they saw the rhythm, and they saw the return. They knew that what looked like endings were often beginnings. They knew that darkness did not last forever. They knew that winter was always going to give way to spring, and they knew that seeds always rose again. And they trusted the cycle. But when that symbolic literacy is lost, the fear takes its place. Confusion, anxiety, and control. People begin to panic about change. They cling to certainty. They demand guarantees. They stop planning because planting requires trust. They stop waiting because waiting requires patience. They stop hoping because hope requires memory. This is why relearning how to read nature is not a hobby, not trivia, it's not nostalgia. It is healing. It stabilizes the mind, it grounds the soul, and it restores perspective. It reminds you that life is not a straight line and it's a rhythm. That loss is not final. That darkness is not permanent, and that uncertainty is not the enemy. That is the rhythm. Ancient people did not need constant reassurance. They had the sky, the seasons, and the patterns. And those patterns never, ever lied. They taught patience, endurance, and trust. This is what we're reclaiming. No more superstition, mythology, pagan fantasies. Understanding. We are not going backward. We're going deeper. We're remembering what it means to be human before fear became our primary language. This is not about changing your beliefs. It's about changing how you see. Because when you see differently, you live differently. You stop rushing. You stop panicking. You stop demanding certainty from a world that was never meant to be frozen. You begin to move with life instead of fighting it. When you move with life, peace becomes possible. Not because everything is perfect, but because everything is meaningful. This is what ancient people knew, and this is what we are remembering. Not a new truth, an old one. As we close today's temple lecture, I want you to remember this. Nothing you heard tonight was meant to burden you. Nothing you heard was meant to confuse you. Nothing you heard was meant to make you afraid. This teaching was meant to restore something, your ability to notice, your ability to recognize meaning and trust life again. You're not designed to live constant urgency. You're not designed to live in constant anxiety, and you're definitely not designed to live in constant fear as certain controllers of these worlds love to keep you. You were designed to live in the rhythm, to move with life, to grow with the seasons, to rest when it's time to rest, to act when it's time to act, to wait when it's time to wait. And most of all, you were designed to understand not everything, but enough. Enough to trust, enough to hope, and enough to plant seeds even when you cannot see the harvest yet. This lecture stirred something in you. It's not an accident. That is memory waking up. If something felt familiar, that is not coincidence. That's recognition. If you felt calmer, it's not a suggestion, it's an alignment. We're not here to give you a new belief system. We are here to restore the natural sight. Because when you see clearly, you live gently. When you see meaning, you stop panicking. When you see rhythm, you stop forcing. That is what the ancient world knew. And this is what we are remembering together. If you felt something shift tonight, don't rush it. Don't analyze it. Just let it settle. Look at the sky this week. Notice the way light changes. Pay attention to small rhythms, not as homework, but as homecoming. We invite you back this Thursday and every Sunday for the next temple lectures here on Rock of Truth Radio, the broadcast arm of Rock of Truth Church. You can find us at rockoftruthchurch.org and here on YouTube. Don't forget to smash that like button and follow. Not because we have all the answers, but because we are asking the right questions. And now you may go in peace because life is simple. Or not because life is simple, but because it's meaningful. Because everything is certain and because you are learning how to see. May your mind be calm, may your heart be steady, and may your spirit be curious. And may your eyes be open. You're not lost, you're remembering. I'll see you here again Thursday, Temple Lecture 2.